Hello everyone, I recently played through Yoshi and the Mysterious Book and I really loved it, which came as a surprise to me because going in, I was expecting the game to be yet another enjoyable but ultimately kinda forgettable 2D platformer in the same vein as some previous Yoshi games. But instead, no, this is easily one of my favorite games on the Switch 2 so far. Now, if you've paid attention to the general online reaction to Yoshi and the Mysterious Book, both before and after its release, my opinion on it may come as a surprise. The fact that the game mainly consists of small explorable sandbox levels instead of linear platforming gauntlets, and especially its lack of a traditional health and death system, has sparked a bit of controversy. Surely it's impossible for a game where the player can't die to feature any kind of difficulty. I guess Nintendo has finally fully committed to the Yoshi franchise's status as games made for babies. Well, having actually played the game for dozens of hours now, I strongly disagree with that idea. Despite its supposed lack of difficulty, Yoshi and the Mysterious Book features some of the most inventive level design I've come across in a long time, which only works because of the choice to avoid some traditional platformer tropes. So today I want to explain why I think that is the case by comparing the game's level design structure to that of regular 2D platformers, and maybe even you will ultimately be convinced that in the case of Yoshi and the Mysterious Book, removing player health and death was actually the right choice all along. By the way, this video will contain spoilers for the game, though there honestly isn't that much to spoil to begin with. Okay, so since my goal is to explain why Yoshi and the Mysterious Book doesn't need a health or death system, it's probably a good idea for us to figure out what the point of these aspects of video games is in the first place. So in any given 2D platformer, why is it that the developers made it to where if the player misses a jump or bumps into a few too many enemies, they are punished by having to replay a part of the level? Well, I think this comes down to a sense of stakes. The threat of taking damage or dying makes avoiding those possibilities by successfully overcoming a level's obstacles all the more rewarding. If missing a jump doesn't result in some sort of setback, then why should the player care about making that jump in the first place? Now, of course, the likelihood of an average player dying in a level and the extent of the setback that this causes varies wildly from game to game. In Celeste, most players probably die hundreds, if not thousands of times before they reach the summit, but the game is designed around this. Every level features numerous checkpoints, and there's no lives system or additional penalty for dying. And on the other side of the spectrum, there's games like the 2D Mario, or more appropriate for this video, Yoshi games, where dying is something that ideally happens occasionally, which is reflected in the way there's only 1 or 2 checkpoints per level, and of course the limited lives system. In fact, I think it's fair to say that levels in these games are designed with the goal of ideally not causing experienced players to die at all. Whereas it's fine for more difficult games to feature design elements that require trial and error gameplay to get the hang of things, the point of these kinds of levels is that every element is introduced so gradually that if the players themselves don't muck anything up, they should be able to see every obstacle coming and overcome everything without dying. And so it is the evolution of those central mechanics, and not the threat of dying, that forms the real meat of the level design of these games. Therefore, I think for most experienced players, interacting with a level's unique combination of gimmicks is what makes any given Mario or Yoshi level memorable. Whereas player damage and death are just necessary parts of the gameplay loop, but not actually things that form the backbone of the overall gameplay experience. If we want to put a label on things, what this really comes down to is the difference between a player's intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. On the one hand, to most people, interacting with unique level gimmicks in a platformer is inherently fun on its own, and so wanting to explore a game's gimmicks just for the sake of it is an intrinsic motivating factor. But the extrinsic motivating factor of wanting to feel the satisfaction of having beaten a level, or a world, or a game, especially a difficult one, ensures that even people who aren't necessarily interested in paying attention to how cleverly a level juggles its gimmicks still have a reason to play most games. I say most games because, well, I believe this divide between a player's intrinsic motivation to explore a game's gimmicks and extrinsic motivation to overcome obstacles perfectly illustrates why Yoshi and the Mysterious Book is so divisive. I think at this point it's probably a good idea for me to go through the overall structure of any given Mysterious Book level. Though the game isn't really made up of levels, but more like relatively small thematically diverse playgrounds that are only somewhat linear maybe half of the time, and always focus on a single central creature. The goal in these habitats is to discover as much as possible about those creatures by interacting with them yourself or making them interact with other gimmicks, with a specific major discovery serving as each level's endpoint. And in case you forgot about the central topic of this video, almost all of these areas are playgrounds and not obstacle courses because the player can't die or even really take damage in them. There are technically a few more linear levels later on that do feature a hard reset death system, but these make up a tiny percentage of the game's overall content. So typically for me, playing any given level involved running back and forth through the same small open area for anywhere between 10 and 30 minutes, trying to discover as much as possible about its central creature and collect all the smiley flowers along the way before manually triggering the end of the level, or without ever facing the possibility of taking damage or dying. And that's obviously such a far cry from the very traditional gameplay loop that's featured in almost every other Yoshi platformer that it's no wonder that a lot of people were thrown off by this. Because of the way some levels, particularly early ones, still almost feel like normal linear gauntlets, it took me some time to adjust to this new system as well. It felt very unnatural casually strolling through the first level before reaching the end very quickly, only to realize I should probably turn back and run around a bunch to discover more about the crazy daisies. I guess that goes to show that despite my own love of exploring gameplay gimmicks, even I sort of got stuck in the extrinsically motivated mindset of just wanting the satisfaction of beating a level without dying. But of course, the fact that Yoshi and the Mysterious Book doesn't feature a death system, and that getting to the end of most of its levels is kinda trivial, means that that traditional extrinsic motivating factor isn't really present in the game at all. I should probably address that this actually isn't the first time Good Feel has made a 2D platformer where the main character can't really die, because that's also the case in Kirby's Epic Yarn. But levels in that game are still designed in a traditional manner, meaning unless you're going for 100%, there's really no reason to avoid dying, and thus in my opinion, Epic Yarn kinda represents the worst of both worlds. Since the discovery of mechanical interactions is kept track of as Yoshi and the Mysterious Book's main collectible required to progress, the game basically takes what is normally the intrinsic motivating factor of traditional 2D platformers and turns it into the extrinsic factor. And this is where the game's difficulty comes from. It often takes a deep understanding of a level's mechanics, or a lot of creativity, or even some platforming prowess to make the most obscure discoveries about any given creature. And the game's surprisingly layered hint system makes it to where it's hard, though still not impossible, to get stuck on any single discovery. But to people expecting the regular 2D platformer gameplay loop of overcoming obstacles, no matter their difficulty, figuring out these environmental puzzles presumably doesn't really result in the same kind of dopamine rush. And that's the thing. I think the problem with the way a lot of people approached this game is that, despite appearances, it's not a 2D platformer. This focus on discovering mechanical interactions basically makes it a puzzle game. I think the dichotomy of the way Yoshi and the Mysterious Book uses the controls and tropes of platformers to craft a very unique puzzle-based adventure is comparable to the Portal games. In case you're not aware, Portal and Portal 2 are puzzle platformers, but they use a first-person shooter control scheme and perspective to facilitate this gameplay, even though the games don't allow you to shoot bullets or fight enemies directly in any way. And so if someone only looked at the superficial aspects of these games and expected them to play like, I don't know, Call of Duty, then they would probably be disappointed. So you can see the obvious comparison to make here. People shouldn't have expected Yoshi and the Mysterious Book to be a traditional 2D platformer in the same way no one expected the Portal games to be traditional shooters. The only problem with that assertion is that Yoshi and the Mysterious Book is still the latest in what is now a trilogy of 2D Yoshi side-scrollers developed by Goodfeel. I think the fact that the game was ultimately marketed as yet another entry in a somewhat consistent franchise made it to where most people, myself included, still didn't fully grasp how different it would be ahead of release. What we ended up getting is a game that doesn't feature a player damage or death system for the same reason you can't die in Pushmo or Fez or any other casual puzzle game. But even though for me the traditionally intrinsic motivating factor of exploring the game's gimmicks ended up being enough of a draw to where I really enjoyed the game, I can't blame people, especially ones who were specifically fans of the tricky platforming in some of the previous games, for not jiving with this sudden shift in focus. Alright, I think I'm pretty much rephrasing the same thing over and over again at this stage, so when it comes to why I think it's not a bad thing that Yoshi can't be killed in the Mysterious Book, I hope I've gotten my point across. However, at the start of the video, I basically implied that this decision wasn't just not a bad thing, but actually helped me fall in love with the game's design. So what is so special about the level design of Yoshi and the Mysterious Book? Well, allow me to use the game's Piranha Plant level as an example. In basically every previous Mario or Yoshi game, Piranha Plants weren't gimmicks with much depth, probably because they often served as beginner enemies. So it was kinda surprising to see that the Mysterious Book would dedicate an entire level to them, especially because this one appears deep into the post-game. The area doesn't actually start with piranha plants though, but with these nipper plants, which are spawned from spores and only later revealed to be variants of the same creature. When a piranha plant is introduced, it doesn't threaten the player with the possibility of taking damage, because again, that's not a thing in this game, it's just here to allow the player to play with it, to see how it works, how it tastes, how it reacts to eggs. After a few more sections focused on the creature's smaller version, the level then ties things together by hinting at the fact that making a nipper plant eat some stuff transforms it into a piranha plant. It then introduces this potted version of the creature, which might seem pointless at first, since you can already carry around nipper plants by default, until you make this little guy grow up, and it all makes sense because now we've got a potted piranha plant, allowing us to use the creature's attacks to our advantage. That's not enough though. Then the level introduces the idea that the plant's diet affects its attributes. So eating grasshoppers makes it green, eating fireflies makes it glow, eating bees gives it a bee-like pattern, eating a golden bug makes it golden, and eating blue butterflies makes it blue and spiky for some reason. This form then allows our piranha plant to defeat this other big piranha plant, which is the discovery that ends the level. Now, nothing here is revolutionary. In fact, the level introduces and evolves ideas in a pretty traditional manner. But the way it manages to do so with what is normally a generic and boring enemy type in such a short span of time is indicative of how the game treats all of its mechanics. This level is one of the shortest in the game, it only took me 5 minutes to beat during my initial playthrough, yet in that time it not only plays with ideas from across the history of this creature, but also like 10 new twists on top of that, only to basically never reuse any of this stuff throughout the rest of the game. I recently made a video that a few people watched about the merits of bespoke visual design in 2D platformers, where terrain is handcrafted for each level instead of reused in a modular way again and again, and Yoshi and the Mysterious Book is not just a perfect example of that design ethos as far as its gorgeous presentation goes, but also in the way it's willing to populate its levels with fruitful gimmicks that only show up once or twice. And yet, at the same time, the game also isn't afraid to combine any given number of its creatures when this leads to interesting interactions. Making a game literally revolve around the discovery of the depth of its mechanics could have been pretty boring had it not been for the fact that, well, Yoshi and the Mysterious Book features a wider variation of mechanical combinations for each of its creatures than any other platformer Nintendo has ever made. And in a lot of cases, these gimmicks and ideas are introduced so rapidly that, again, a traditional damage and death system couldn't have worked with this. A large part of the reason why enemies and mechanics don't tend to be introduced this quickly in traditional platformers is because teaching the player about a level's gimmicks always has to happen alongside threatening them with the possibility of death, usually through those same mechanics, meaning things end up evolving only very gradually. So by praising the way the Mysterious Book expands upon every idea it introduces to a sometimes ridiculous degree, I'm not saying traditional 2D platformers are lackluster in this regard by comparison, it's just that these are two different genres of games with different priorities and thus different inherent pros and cons. And speaking of cons, in order to counteract the negativity I've seen surrounding this game, I've pretty much exclusively praised it in this video so far, but that doesn't mean I don't have my own gripes. Most of the problems I have with Yoshi and the Mysterious Book stem from the way the game still kinda sticks too closely to that traditional 2D platformer formula I keep harping on about. Take that example I gave of my experience playing the game's first level. Sure, I should have realized that I was gonna have to run around this area quite a bit to find all of the discoveries, but the fact that the level is pretty much completely linear made that hard to sense ahead of time. And once I did start frantically running back and forth looking for more stuff to do, well, that linear design, which appears in maybe half of the levels in the game, made exploring the area non-linearly feel kinda awkward. I would have preferred it if every level stuck to the open sandbox approach, that way exploration wouldn't just feel like backtracking. I feel similarly about the structural oddity of how levels end. Like I mentioned earlier, every creature in the game can lead the player to some kind of major discovery which serves as the level's overall goal. This decision kinda makes sense, since a lot of levels are non-linear, they can't have an actual goal point, and this also makes the game's discovery mechanic crucial to beating it, even if you're mostly trying to rush through stuff. But what exactly this major discovery entails varies so wildly, both in terms of mechanical depth and ease of achievability, that I often felt like a level's major discovery was less of a culmination of its ideas and more just an arbitrary endpoint. And I say endpoint, most of the time I would make these discoveries long before I was actually done exploring. Now, the game does account for this by allowing you to opt out of ending a level after finding its ultimate discovery, but this means the only way to exit the level is by going into the menu and just quitting. Maybe this is just a me problem, but I think that's very strange. Normally in most video games, quitting out of a level isn't basically the default way of progressing. And in fact, I found it genuinely frustrating how a lot of levels feature discoveries that are mutually exclusive, meaning you're sometimes forced to reset a level just to be able to discover everything about its creatures. The game's confusion over whether it should or shouldn't try to be a traditional 2D platformer is also evident in the way it handles boss fights. Since you can't take damage in the game, yeah, these things are indescribably easy. You can't die, so there are zero stakes. This is also probably why the developers opted to only make a small handful of boss fights. A lot of worlds just end with Yoshi interacting with Bowser Jr. and Kamek in a way that doesn't involve fighting anything, really. I could say that I would have preferred it if the developers fully committed to the puzzle platformer genre and didn't bother with even a single boss fight, but I get that that would have made things like the game's ending anticlimactic. Though currently the ending is still anticlimactic, since the final fight is hilariously easy, so maybe there really was no getting around this problem. Now, I know that earlier I raved about how impressive most of the game's creature gimmicks are, but while I'm at it, I should also point out that sometimes the game's ambitious mechanics clearly took priority over that typical Nintendo sense of polish. It is impressive how diverse most of these ideas are. A lot of creatures form unique accessories or weapons or modes of transport for Yoshi, but interacting with especially some of the game's larger creatures often led to janky mishaps and even straight up glitches. For every dozen or so creatures that I really enjoyed messing around with, there was one I found kinda unintuitive, unpolished, unimaginative, or all of the above. Finally, I also want to say something about the game's presentation. You don't need me to tell you that Yoshi and the Mysterious Book is a gorgeous game. I think the quality of the diverse art styles found across the Yoshi franchise has gone up and down quite drastically over the years, but this has to be a high point up there right alongside Yoshi's Woolly World and Island. I love the way the game manages to make all of its 3D models look like hand-drawn illustrations, with distant elements taking on more of a sketched look. And although the jittery animations that also aim to mimic hand-drawn visuals maybe take some getting used to, these end up only adding to the overall aesthetic in my opinion. As you may be aware, this art style, plus the game's impressively dynamic physics and fluid systems, are probably partially the result of the developer's decision to use Unreal Engine 5 of all things. But sadly, whether it's because of the engine or because the decision was made to prioritize ambitious ideas over the game's smoothness, throughout my playthrough I experienced quite a few lag spikes. I don't just mean that the game dropped some frames occasionally, though it did also do that in particularly busy areas. No, like, sometimes the game would just freeze for maybe a third of a second in a way that I don't think I've ever experienced consistently in any other Nintendo game. Apart from those blemishes, the game does actually run very smoothly, like 90% of the time, but I do think it's sad that this is yet another game released within the Switch 2's first year on the market that sometimes struggles to hit a consistent 60 FPS. The other side of the game's presentation, its music, is also hit or miss for me. The soundtrack of Yoshi and the Mysterious Book is comprised of tracks that start off relatively ambient, but tend to build up the more discoveries you make in any given level. This was a really neat trick the first 20 or so times I experienced it, but as the game goes on, I think it reuses the same themes a few too many times. Also, when I sometimes got kinda stuck in a level because it took me a while to figure out how to make certain discoveries, having to listen to songs that loop every minute or so for like half an hour started becoming very grating. I think the game's slightly understated soundtrack definitely doesn't reach the heights of, again, Yoshi's Woolly World and Island, but it's also nowhere near the depths of New Island and Crafted World, so I'm decently happy with it. Overall, I think Yoshi and the Mysterious Book represents a leap of faith taken by the developers over at Goodfeel that mostly paid off. It's clear that the choice to avoid the typical 2D platformer formula that the Yoshi franchise has generally stuck to up to this point has rubbed some people the wrong way, but I think it led to an extremely memorable, albeit also slightly flawed game that overall I love quite a bit. I'll gladly take another 10 exploration and puzzle-based Yoshi games over some of the decent but ultimately derivative entries in the franchise we've gotten previously. Nintendo already makes loads of other very traditional 2D platformer games, so I think one series evolving to be something more unique can only really be a good thing. And that's all I wanted to talk about in this video. Fun fact, when I decided I was gonna make a video about Yoshi and the Mysterious Book before the game had even come out, I figured I'd probably end up making it specifically about the game's art style. In hindsight, I think I mostly landed on that idea because I assumed the actual game design wouldn't be anything to write home about, but clearly I was mistaken. So I was definitely pleasantly surprised by Yoshi and the Mysterious Book, and I'm sure if you've played it, you've got plenty of your own spicy opinions on the game as well. If so, maybe tell me about them by leaving a comment. While you're down there, maybe also consider leaving a like, or subscribing, or checking out my Discord server linked in the description, or signing up for a YouTube channel membership to support the channel and get early access to upcoming videos. Thank you so much for watching, and bye bye!